The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, I got out of bed on a Monday morning, and the first thing I saw was version 8.0 of your trade board. The top 5 reads as follows: Vincent Trocheck, Nazem Kadri, Robert Thomas, Justin Falk, Tyler Myers. First off, CJ, thank you for your work on this glorious trade board so we can have something to talk about today. But also, just generally speaking, and I'll ask specifically about some of the guys on this list, but what's the sense ahead of deadline day in terms of all this excitement?
Well, I appreciate your support, but I got to say, you got to work on the morning routine if the first thing out of bed is you diving into a trade board.
Yeah, that's probably true. I should probably pray to God first and then do that.
Exactly. Right. What about to drink a water, meditate?
Got the water first, though. But yeah, I should get back to meditating. I know
just
you're teasing.
Poking you, my friend.
I know you're
yeah, I mean, look, it's the big week's finally here. It's funny feeling, isn't it? Just I think because of the Olympics and really because there hasn't really been too much on the trade front just yet. I'd say it's a little bit of a muted start to this deadline week, but history does tell us there's going to be moves, there's going to be trades, obviously, and it felt a little quiet, I'll be honest with you, over the weekend. Now, I do think some things are picking up, around the players at the top of the board, which is partly what elevates them to the top of the board. But I think the center market in particular is worth watching because, you have a lot of the same teams, perhaps, making calls on the same player, because that's a pretty big need in certain places to find a center that can help you out. But, I don't know what to expect this week. One thing we'll point out, I'm sure we'll talk about this as it goes along, but the new CBA rules are definitely in the minds of some people out there that are, working for teams. Just the idea that there is a playoff salary cap now, I think, changes the kind of trades some teams might make. Definitely expensive veterans, just because you could fit them under your cap for the remainder of the regular season, might be a little less appealing due to the playoff cap because, you might not be able to play them in the playoffs. And, the fact that you can't double retain on trades that are made in real time, that used to be as we know, this player through this other team cut a salary in half.
Mm-hmm.
Used to be something that helped a lot of deals get done. So, I think that while I'm saying, history tells us there's going to be lots of action, and I still believe there is. I'm an optimist here. We should just mention that those factors are in play. And I did hear from a few team sources over the weekend. They were a little surprised by how quiet it felt, but just takes one move to get the ball rolling, of course.
Calm before the storm, CJ.
Yeah, and look, some teams are still figuring it out, right? Like a tough loss, for example, for the Florida Panthers on Sunday. That has definitely been a team that could tip in either direction. They've lost 2 of 3, after beating the Leafs last week. So, maybe they pivot to selling a few players. I think that those dynamics are still in the works. So, someone did mention last night, look for Tuesday, Wednesday for things to pick up, that it just might take a little bit of time. And if that, I like to think of it, if we're not seeing a lot of moves now, I mean, it could get pretty crazy, right? In the last few days, because any way you slice it, there's really not that much time left in the trading season. And I think there's still a lot of teams out there looking to get stuff done.
Okay, I want to go through some specific names on this list. Nazem Kadri, I know he's number 2 on your list, but he's top of mind for me. I'm sure you saw a post from Eric Francis from Sportsnet. Anaheim and Calgary played against each other over the weekend, and members of Colorado's front office were in town. I'm in Anaheim, I should say. The idea of Nazem Kadri going back to Colorado, it makes sense, at least just on the surface. Is that something that could realistically happen? How many other teams could be interested in one Nazem Kadri?
Definitely things are picking up with talks between the Avalanche and the Flames. And, look, the Avs are in LA, I believe. So it wasn't a far commute. It wasn't as though those people that Eric mentioned flew across the country to see Nazem Kadri. Obviously, they know a lot about Nazem Kadri. They were around when he was a member of the team previously. But I will say this, having watched some of that game last night, Nazem Kadri played like a guy who knew there was some important eyeballs on him. He made almost ended the game in overtime, scored a shootout goal. And, frankly, he's played quite well, especially since the return from the Olympic break. Went through a little of a dry spell earlier in the season. And I do think it's getting more and more likely, I would say, that he moves. There's always been a little bit of a question mark with him just because of the contract term remaining, on 3 more years for a guy who's 35. Obviously there's a little buyer beware attached to, having a player sign that late. But, in the last little while here, it seems like multiple teams have kicked tires on him. The Montreal Canadiens are a team that have at least had discussions about Kadri. I don't know how much urgency is there for them. I'm not saying they're beating down the door, but he's been a guy that's been discussed. I think makes sense. Minnesota's looking for a center. Always wonder what Tampa's going to do. They're one of the best teams in the league and could definitely see them getting in on one of these forwards, kind of stealth-like, which is how Julian Brisebois tends to do business. The Utah Mammoth are looking for a center. Carolina, I think, could potentially be a fit. But we have to remember as well, Nazem Kadri has some trade protection, and in a limited no trade clause. So I'm not saying that he would definitely go to all those places, but I think that's the kind of interest that he's drumming up at this point. And they still got to get something across the line. It's not done until it's done. But, right now, the way it looks is that Colorado could be at the front of the list. But, we're down to one phone call territory now where everything could change in a moment's notice. But certainly having, some key decision makers in the Avalanche front office in the building and the fact that Colorado did free up a little bit more cap space with the Samuel Girard, Brett Kulak move they made with Pittsburgh recently, needing to address or wanting to address a third line center position, and I think if you're going to do that, it does make sense to bring someone back who, has been a fit in the past. Really, if when I look at the Avalanche, Julian, they're trying to rediscover that old glory, right? I mean, they've only won one playoff round since the 2022 Stanley Cup. Amazing to think, given the level of talent on their roster. And so what do teams across professional sports often do? When you're looking back to do something you've done before, I think familiar faces often, we see players that have had a good run return, or managers or coaches or what have you. Lindy Ruff is on the Buffalo Sabres bench right now is another easy example, right? But I think sometimes when the personality, it's easier to make that kind of trade. So, Kadri, it's definitely heated up there. I know he'd welcome a move to Colorado when I mentioned the trade stuff. So, we'll see if they can get something done here in the next day or two.
Is this a situation where if a move happens with Kadri that the Flames might have to retain? For context, he will be a UFA in 2029 when he'll be 38, and the cap hit is at $7 million per until then.
I'm sure everyone's asking for that. That would be, that's one way to mitigate the concern that I mentioned about having those years remaining on the contract. The interest is high enough that I can't say for sure they're going to have to. And, typically teams, when they're retaining, they're more comfortable retaining on a player who's, say, on an expiring deal or maybe has one more year left. When you start retaining 3 years beyond now, pro sports changes so quickly. You don't necessarily want that money on the books if you're Calgary. So I can't say for sure whether they're going to have to retain to make that work. There's other ways you can do it, taking back salary from another player or what have you. But, I do think just from a pure standpoint of looking at it, Colorado has the ability to fit in Nazem Kadri on their cap sheet. But, the cheaper you can get a player, the better of an asset he is, right? I'm sure we'll get into, for example, the Toronto Maple Leafs later in the show, but I'll just point you to an example from them last year when they acquired Brandon Carlo and Scott Laughton. In both cases, their salaries were held back to some degree by the team that traded them. So now if we're in a world where the Leafs are flipping those players, they're able to chop down the salary even more. And so that makes the players better assets on the market. So, I'm sure that will be discussed, but I would think that there's enough teams out there that, what that tells me is that someone will take Kadri at full value if they have to.
Hold your fire on the Toronto Maple Leafs, because you're right, we will get into that team. I'd like to know just a bit more generally on Craig Conroy and the deadline that comes ahead for him. Nazem Kadri, we just spent a couple minutes on him, but Blake Coleman is also on this list. Zach Whitecloud, who they acquired earlier this season in exchange for Rasmus Andersson, also on this list. What do you think, or how busy do you anticipate this week being for Craig Conroy?
Well, I actually think it could be busier in some other places. When I look at, a Vancouver, a Toronto, even the Rangers, St. Louis, I think those teams probably, we might be talking about them trading more volume out the door, at least if they're able to create the market they need to do that. What the Flames have though is, you got Coleman and Kadri both in my top 5 or 6 or whatever. I shuffled around so many times.
Coleman
lost.
6.
But the point is they're both in demand players, and they're both, I think that they're real assets, and in Coleman's case, it's funny. Some teams like the Dallas Stars, when they're making moves at this deadline, they really are prioritizing players on expiring deals, mostly because they have, Jason Robertson's contract to take care of this summer, Maverick Bourque. They want to maintain flexibility, and obviously they're locked into some other big money deals with the contracts they've signed with, Harley and Rantanen and having Heiskanen and so, a team like that is prioritizing rentals. Some teams like getting a player that they know is going to be around for a couple playoff runs, right? And that's where Blake Coleman comes into the conversation. So it's not one size fits all at the deadline, but certainly I think with how good a 200-foot player Coleman is, there's interest in him. And so I could see when the dust settles in Calgary, maybe it's 2 trades, but it could be 2 pretty big trades, right? It could be Coleman and Kadri being the guys out the door. Whitecloud's definitely not someone the Flames feel they have to move, but look where they're at. He's a veteran player. If they can get something that makes sense, I think they'll do it. I think that sort of feeling, persists actually around a lot of players on a board like this. I don't know how fans, when you're making the board, I don't know how people are viewing it. It does, just because someone's listed there is certainly not a guarantee they're moved. Even if someone's listed quite high, but it's a mix of, someone like Tyler Myers, who I know we'll get to, is almost certainly going to be moved. So, he's pretty high up and his situation is unfolding in real time. So I think he should be, represented pretty high on there. But some other players, it's more teams are listening. And if they get to a certain maybe threshold with the pick coming back or whatever it is, that they'll make the move. I mean, even Boston, which was the big seller last year at the deadline, I know that they ended up selling a little bit more than they thought they would just because the prices went in their favor. They didn't feel they had to move Brandon Carlo entering that deadline. He still had 2 years on his deal, but the Leafs gave them the first round pick and Fraser Minton, who was a prospect they really liked. And, it started to make a lot of sense on the Bruins end. And so they ended up getting more business done. So, it's hard to forecast with certainty what's going to happen in any of these markets. But, I think in Calgary, it's clear that they're selling again. they're at the bottom of the standings. And, some of these guys, while they really like them as culture players, I mean, there is risk with holding on to a Kadri too. I mean, if his game really falls off in the next year, maybe at next year's deadline, he's very available, but he's not in the top 5 on the trade board. Right. So, I think you got a sense of timing is important. And so, very much seems like Coleman and Kadri are going out the door, and we'll see if they do more business than that.
Let's go from Calgary to Vancouver, who you mentioned earlier. Tyler Myers, number 5 on your trade board, but a whole bunch of other players listed: Evander Kane, Elias Pettersson, Connor Garland, Teddy Blueger, Jake DeBrusk, David Kampf, also on that list. Let's set the scene a little bit more for Patrick Allvin and the Vancouver Canucks this week.
Yeah, I mean, look, you could probably put more names on that list too. I mean, it's basically the whole roster available, minus their young players that they really like, and Filip Hronek, who, they don't have any appetite to move. But beyond that, I think they're willing to discuss anything. And I think they'd really like to get busy here. I mean, they're last with a bit of room right now in the league. They have embraced the rebuild. They have embraced the idea that, of course, if you finish last, you could still fall to the 3rd overall pick. But if you finish last, the worst you can fall to is the 3rd overall pick. So there's no
still prime position.
Exactly. There's no guarantee they're getting number 1 or number 2 just by having this type of season. But they want the odds stacked in their favor. They're incorporating some young players into the lineup now, and there's not too many untouchables on this Canucks roster. Tyler Myers was a situation where, I don't know that he necessarily was someone they felt they had to move, but, the Detroit Red Wings came up with, what I'm hearing is a second round pick as an offer. Seemed like good value to the Canucks. And obviously they've taken it to Tyler, and, so far he hasn't waived his no movement clause. So that deal hasn't gone through. I think, he's still waiting to see if anything else emerges. At this time, I'm not sure there's anything else on the table for him. At least in terms of a firm offer. There's certainly other interest around the league. And, it's a tough call if you're a player who really doesn't want to move, as Myers doesn't. He's been in Vancouver a long time now. It's a great setup for his family. I think he was personally inclined to just finish out his contract as a Canuck and be a good positive role model in the dressing room, do all those types of things, good professional. But he's also 6'8" right shot defenseman, who I think has value used in a specific role, which, you're seeing with the fact Detroit, has stepped up and is trying to trade for him. So, there's been pressure there to make a decision. I don't want to say there's any true deadline. But there is got to be a deadline in the sense, if it's the Detroit option at a certain point, they're going to have to move on and start looking at other players. Maybe another team emerges. It's kind of a weird one, but Myers has already sat out a couple of games, took the warm up. I don't know if you noticed Saturday, he actually wore a helmet and warm up after previously taking a warm up with no helmet on, because I think the Canucks want to make sure they're protecting their asset as best they can. Don't want to make light of that, but occasionally flying pucks around, something bad could happen. And so, yeah, it's at this point, it's hard to imagine it's not going to end up in a trade, but the player has the clause, and if we went through every player on this trade board, I bet, I haven't done the exercise, but I bet like 80% of them at least have some form of trade protection in their contracts. So that's a big thing that teams have to navigate this time of year as well. It's not as simple as GM A calling GM B and making a deal. Oftentimes a player has a say in what happens too.
Anything else you wanted to mention about some of the other players listed for Vancouver before I get to Vincent Trocheck, the number one player on your list?
Where do we start with the Canucks? Look, Teddy Bluger, David Kampf, Evander Kane, those are all players on expiring deals. So, I think that they're the ones the Canucks, feel they should be able to get something for on the market. And, I think all things being equal, they'd like to trade them all. Might not be possible, especially if it doesn't end up being as much trade activity this year. What's interesting is, can they get any action on the players with contract, right, in term, and bigger names at this point? I think Connor Garland's someone that definitely there's interest in him around the league, and I can see him finding a new home at some point, but it doesn't have to happen now. Isn't frankly the kind of trade we see happen a lot at the deadline. Players with big term, kind of mid-career guys, we'll call them, which will come up as a factor when we get to the Robert Thomas discussions, because he's in that boat himself, but the Canucks basically, I think, are putting the call out. Like, Brock Besser isn't on this board, but if someone really wants Brock Besser, I think they'd look at it. Now, Besser has trade protection as well, so he'd have a say there. So the Canucks are going to be as busy as the market says their players, should be. Is probably the last thought I'd put on them for this point in time. But, it sounded like not a ton going on. Vander Kane certainly could see him moving, and then the other guys I mentioned, for low level draft picks, kind of insurance for other teams. Teddy Bluger's actually played pretty well at the Olympics for Latvia and missed a huge chunk of this season with injury, and has been performing well for the Canucks. So I think he's got a little bit of value out there as a depth forward as well.
All right, moving on from the Vancouver Canucks, let's go to New York. Vincent Trocheck, number one on your board. What's actually really interesting is seeing the top three guys are centers, the top and number 4 and number 5 right shot defenseman. Feels like those two positions, in my opinion, are probably going to be the hottest ones to look out for this year. You could tell me otherwise, but Vincent Trocheck being number one on this list, what do you see about what's going on with him and the Rangers and where he could end up next?
Well, did you see the interview that he had? I wish I knew which broadcast, where his son cooked him pretty good after the Four Nations last year. He was saying that his son, after they lost the championship game in Boston to Team Canada, was crying and he was saying, "Dad, you're never going to win anything." Which is, I'm laughing now because, of course, he has something now. He did get to win a gold medal and share that with his family. There's certainly, I do expect Trocheck to move. Still feels like a Minnesota trade to me, even though obviously the Wild, are somewhat inhibited just because they've already given up so much in the Quinn Hughes trade. They aren't stocked fully to, go and chase a center like Vincent Trocheck in an aggressive way, the way they were aggressive in getting that Quinn Hughes done with the Canucks. Detroit Red Wings, I think, are a team to watch on Trocheck. It's interesting. Detroit, we haven't maybe focused on them as much. It just seems, not because we're nothing personal, just the way it's kind of gone. But, they're in a similar spot to Buffalo, right? They haven't, it's been a long time since they made the playoffs. I know they've been close a couple times in recent years. But they seem to be back to, like, if you're old enough to remember the way the old Red Wings were, they seem to be out in the marketplace looking to make deals. Obviously, I mentioned Tyler Myers earlier. I think they're going to add a blue liner if for whatever reason that trade doesn't come together. I would expect they're going to be elsewhere and could see them, bringing in someone to bolster the center position as well with Trocheck. So, he's still playing games for the Rangers, so nothing got close enough that he's a roster related scratch, but I think we're entering that territory pretty soon. There's certain places I think Trocheck is less inclined to go. As I mentioned, Utah looking for a center, might be a little far from home, from the East Coast for his liking. But certainly in the East, and I'll count Minnesota as sort of East, Central time zone, but not distance wise so far. I think there's enough interest there to see him end up in a place that he's happy to go to, that, wants to bring him on. I mean, look, that Team USA performance, I think, gave you everything you needed to know about him. Was a key penalty killer on a team that didn't go up any goals. Great face-off guy, good character guy. I think he has a little more offense in his game when you look at how he'll be used in the NHL versus on a best-on-best type of situation. But, really solid all-around player. I wonder if a reunion in Carolina might even make sense, honestly. He obviously spent time there previously, but, does things the right way, doesn't make too much money, and a couple of years on his deal, I think could be viewed as a positive thing for teams that feel they're in a contention window and are going to go at it not just this year, but next year and the year after.
Any inclination as to what the Rangers could be looking for in terms of an asking price?
Well, it's high. That's kind of the word right now, and it's usually first plus when you're getting into the players. At this range on the market, I had him number one on the board. You might quibble and have him 2 or 3, but the point is he's one of the most attractive names and players on the market anyway you slice it and rank those things. It's going to be a little bit of a haul. That's probably what's held it up from happening sooner, quite honestly, is, naturally as these things go, you set a high target, but maybe you're willing to chisel it down a little bit as the deadline gets closer on both sides. And similarly, teams are going to up their offers. So, we see where it ends up, but you're looking at multiple pieces and attractive futures, because the Rangers clearly are in rebuild mode. Those types of assets are important to an organization in that kind of posture.
I know we've bounced around the top 5, but we'll round out that talk with the St. Louis Blues. Robert Thomas, number 3, Justin Falk, number 4, but also on your board, Braden Shen, Jordan Binnington, also there, and Jordan Kyrou. Doug Armstrong with a lot of work to be done with the St. Louis Blues this week, don't you think?
100%. And look, it's the second year in a row his players have been well represented on this board. Now, last year, St. Louis went on a crazy run, actually, after the Four Nations tournament and ended up making the playoffs with a veteran-laden team, so that the sell-off that could have happened last season didn't happen. There's no such run coming this year. I think it's pretty clear which direction the Blues are going. There's been some conversations already with Doug Armstrong and some of the players on this board about their trade clauses, about basically where they're at, how it's going to go. I think what the marketplace wonders a little bit is, how many of these guys are actually going to move. And it's sort of like the question you asked about Calgary, Julian. But the Blues are sort of notorious for putting their players out there, having trade talks, and then maybe not being motivated to actually make the trade. Almost just setting a really high price, and if you don't meet it, then they hold on to them. That's happened before. Could easily happen again here. But I can tell you that in the Thomas circumstance, especially, that there's been a lot of conversation there. He does have a no trade clause, so he's got the ability to help shape what happens too. But this one does feel like it could get done at this deadline. As I mentioned, it's not the kind of player with 5 years left on his deal that you usually see as a deadline move. This is more off-season draft kind of trade, when you see this sort of player go. And because of what Robert Thomas is, you're not just bringing in what we're calling the buyers at this deadline, right? I mean, there's other teams that aren't necessarily in the playoff position for this year, but that, look at him and say, okay, that could start, a year that could start us on the right track for next season and the years beyond it if we made that move now. And so, Utah, a lot of steam in that direction. Bill Armstrong, who's the Mammoth general manager, worked for years for St. Louis, has a history in helping them draft. Robert Thomas, Utah's a pretty exciting place right now. That the Mammoth are, they're in these kind of conversations because they really want to make the playoffs. They want to ensure that they take the next step from the ones they've kind of, if you look back, it's been like a staircase up in terms of the number of points they've had the last 4 or 5 years. Going back to their time in Arizona, they've kind of patiently built, and it's getting to the point where they can't be completely patient. Now, I don't think they're going to do anything crazy at this deadline. If they're giving up a lot of picks and prospects, it's for a player like Robert Thomas, who's signed and who's going to be, is kind of in line with the age of where they want for their roster and is going to be part of their group for a long time. I don't see them giving up crazy assets for a rental, for example. But, even I think a team like the Toronto Maple Leafs has at least been nosing around on a Robert Thomas, even though, we're going to talk about the Leafs being in a clear seller position. If there was a way that they could make a trade like that make sense, I mean, there's an argument to make it. So, his situation could go in a few different roads. And the truth is, perhaps all this conversation happens now. They don't get to something by Friday afternoon that everyone is comfortable with. And we're just talking about this again in the off season. But, certainly in St. Louis, they've got teams around Falk as well. That's a different proposition. He's got one more year on his deal, veteran player. He's having a really good season. I think there's a lot to like there. 4 teams, he can play both sides of the ice, as needed, just a solid pro. And I think there's a number, the Edmonton Oilers would love to get a Justin Falk if things could make sense. I think the Buffalo Sabres have been around kicking tires on him. A lot of the teams that have a hole in their blue line, see things they like in him. And so that would be a trade. I think when we get to deadline day, pretty comfortable saying that player will likely be on the go. And then, some of the other names, they're out there because the Blues will take those calls. But, I don't have any indication at this point, for example, a Kyrou trade is coming down in the next few days. But again, we're into one call territory, man. The truth right now isn't necessarily going to be the truth in 2 hours, depending on decisions that are made. And that's what makes this week so exciting, is the fact that certain things can pop up maybe that, we don't entirely see coming.
I could totally see Ottawa expressing interest on Justin Falk too. Just want to throw them in there. I know I'll briefly mention the Sens at some point, but figured I'd sprinkle them in.
Don't be brief, man. Big win in Toronto on the weekend. I mean, it's funny. They're still at a chase position for the playoffs, but they just seem like the vibes are a little better than some of the other teams around them in the standings, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like if you look at how the underlying metrics look for them offensively and defensively, like this is a team that should not be 5 points out of a playoff spot. We all know why they're in this position that they're in, but I think this team should be buying. Maybe not a massive deal, but they should be looking to add and not necessarily selling and trying to get picks. I get the prospect pool isn't as great for them, but I see them trying to do something ahead of Friday.
It's a risk though, right? I mean, I guess it depends what you're buying. If you're buying a rental, for example, and you end up missing the playoffs, maybe you don't feel as good about that. Now, if they were able to get a Falk or someone like that, and Justin Falk, stop me if you've heard this before, another player who has some control of his situation with trade protection. So, he's ultimately going to have a say in whatever happens or doesn't with his situation. But, I guess if you're bringing on someone with term and as part of what you're looking for longer term, then there's a little less risk tied to what happens here in the next 20 games.
Exactly. But yeah, the Blues, I'm glad we were able to touch on them. Do you want, actually, you know what? I thought about this. I thought about either just going straight to the Leafs because I know we're going to get a lot, but there's one guy I really want to get to who is also in the top 10 on your list, and that's Steven Stamkos. What do you think of his situation and the fact that, at least publicly, he very much likes it in Nashville, but there is a list of suitors who want his services?
Yeah, I think privately likes it in Nashville too. I mean, I have no reason to doubt everything Steven Stamkos said into microphones in the last few days. I don't think this is a case of a guy begging to get out of there or anything like that. But, as our colleague Pierre Lebrun reported, there is kind of an industry sentiment about the kinds of places he would consider waiving his no movement clause if the Predators came to him. And I think that's just, frankly, I think it's just good business if you're Stamkos. Look at where Nashville is. And I know they're hanging around the playoff picture in kind of this weird turtle race in that, for that wild card spot. But, where Nashville is right now is there's going to be a regime change after, this season. Barry Trotz has signaled that he's done as GM. I think there's a recognition the organization has to start going in some other directions. They put their chips in when they signed Stamkos and Brady Shea and Jonathan Marchessault and brought in older players and they're not going to contend, even though they are in the mix for a playoff spot. So, I think if you're Stamkos, you have to at least think, hey, they might come to me on Wednesday of this week. And at this point, I have no reason to believe the Predators have come to him and had this conversation. But, it would make sense that Stamkos and his agents have thought things through on how they might answer that question if it was raised to them. And so you get the list of teams that Pierre circulated off the top of my head. It was Minnesota, Dallas,
Tampa, New Jersey as a potential fourth option. Tampa's, intriguing. The thing is, though, is the reason Steven Stamkos, or the main reason he's not in Tampa right now, is because the contract he was about to sign, right? And, he did say at that time he would have done a hometown discount with the Lightning. So he would have taken even less than he has. But the contract here is not to be ignored. Even though Stamkos has hit 30 goals already again this season, I mean, he's still got a dangerous shot, can still be a power play weapon for a team that needs it. Feels like an off-season move, but just given that the teams are out there and there's some name value with the player, he is down to just next year and the year after. The fact he can still do what he's done so well for a long, long time in the NHL, it could happen, but I'd say the odds are a little stronger in favor of this being a discussion that's had with Stamkos and the Predators sometime this summer. But let's see how the coming days go and what they bring. All right. Are you ready to do a Leafs Corner on this podcast?
Always ready. Born ready for that.
5 members of the Toronto Maple Leafs on the board. Number 10, Oliver Ekman-Larsson atop them. Bobby McMahon, Scott Laughton, Simon Benoit, Kylie Yarncroke also on this list. You mentioned the fact that the vibes in Ottawa, a little bit better. The vibes, not so great in Toronto, considering where they're at in the standings. What do you think of the week ahead for Brad Treliving and the Toronto Maple Leafs?
I mean, it's a tough week if you're in Brad Treliving's seat because, at the end of the day, as much as we and the market are going to focus on, the Leafs as sellers and them having to sell, you don't want to just sell the players for nothing, right? At the end, you have to, when all is said and done, feel good about the return you're getting in order to make this make sense. Now, some of the pending UFAs, if they don't end up signing Bobby McMahon, and as of this weekend, they were still trying, so that's no guarantees they won't. But if they don't get him signed to an extension, I think you have to move someone like that, a Scott Laughton in a similar spot, just because you're trying to at least get something back for them. But the Oliver Ekman-Larssons or other players that do have some term left, you got to be careful there. And I think Ekman-Larsson, all things being equal, would like to stay. He's got to half no trade protection as well. But, he also is having a tremendous season and it sounds like could bring them back a first round pick and maybe something beyond that. So, I think it's a difficult week to navigate if you're Tree Living, especially because the market isn't heated up just yet, right? I mean, teams do need two to tango, so to speak. And if it ends up being a bit of a buyer's market and there's more players available than are, attractive assets out there, this could be a long week in Toronto where maybe the selling does, you almost feel like when the team has performed as it has, I think that almost ups the expectation in the fan base that okay, they're really going to pivot hard into selling. And I think people want to see the start of a new shift in direction. It'll be fascinating to see if they aren't able to drum up the interest they need to make that make sense. Either way, don't get me wrong. I think we're going to be talking about the Leafs making trades, but whether we're talking about 3 players out the door or 4 or 5 or 6, that's going to be very market dependent. And Tree Living's got to get this right. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The last year's trade deadline, with the benefit of hindsight, the Leafs didn't get it right. I think, the one thing I'll say, because history will revise itself, I think that the Leafs had every reason to go in as they did at last year's deadline. They ended up finishing atop the Atlantic Division. Obviously, they beat the Ottawa Senators in the first round. They got to a Game 7 with Florida. We know how it went, but they were pretty close to being a team that could go on a run. And I think they had a reason to believe they could go on a run. So, it just turns out with hindsight, they might not have, or I can say they didn't get the right players maybe for the level of assets they gave up. They were chasing it a little bit. But this is an important deadline. You're not going to undo all that in one trade deadline. Don't get me wrong. When you trade Scott Laughton at this deadline, you're not getting back what you paid for him, but that, at this point, that's a sunk cost. And so I do think it's important for the Leafs to come out of this with the cupboards a little better stocked, with maybe some positions on the roster for younger guys. I personally think there's an argument for, basically setting the conditions where you fall down the standings. Mm-hmm. I know I'm saying that in a market where they don't own their first round pick if it falls at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, if it's after the top 5. But I think, look at the defensive results. Look how the year's gone. The fact you're going to, we know they have injuries on this roster. I mean, that has played some role in this, but maybe you shut a couple players down and get them healing. And so they're in a position to help you more next year. I think that there's an argument for it, although the math is not particularly in the Leafs' favor then. And if you bring that into play, you bring in the possibility you're giving the Bruins a really high pick. But to me, I would want better lottery odds because they could potentially win first or second pick, with better odds. And look what that did for the Islanders this year. They won the lottery last year. They weren't the last place team in the league. And Matthew Schaefer just scored his 20th goal on Sunday night. I mean, it's almost impossible to believe an 18-year-old defenseman has been that good, but he's changed their whole franchise. I'm not going to put those hopes on any of the top picks of this year's draft, but if the Leafs somehow got one of them, and while also having, a Matthews and a Nylander and some of the players that are already there, I think it vastly changes the outlook. And so, I would be making the argument for them to try to help things fall back. I don't believe that that's what Tree Living and Company will do, though. But look they're caught in the middle, man. I think they're almost the same number of points from the 5th bottom spot as they are from a playoff spot, and they're not likely to land in either zone.
Yeah, it's the worst place you could be. You feel free to size up the market for each of these players, but one guy I'm particularly interested in is Scott Laughton. We talk about the fact that at the top of your board, and I get it, there are other players you can look at, but the center position is very much prominent. I wonder how that could stack up as a domino effect for a player like Scott Laughton, who is much more affordable cap-wise compared to a Vinny Trocheck or a Nazem Kadri.
Yeah, well, it definitely helps. And, he's already been carved down to a $1.5 million cap hit, in the first move with Philadelphia. The Leafs can obviously chop that to $750 if they're so inclined. They have a retention spot to do it. And, when you're adding a player like that, who ticks a lot of boxes, high character guy, good work rate, sticks up for his teammates, can win you a face-off. I think they should definitely be able to turn him into something of interest in terms of the draft pick coming back their way. And so, there was a reason the Leafs gave up a first rounder for him. It might have been a stretch, but they were getting him at 50% retention and he wasn't on an expiring deal, which appealed to them at the time. Very much think that contenders will like the idea of a Scott Laughton as cheap as he might be, just given some of the playoff considerations and the new cap rules that everyone has to consider.
Anything else you want to mention about Toronto before I touch on the rest of the Canadian picture ahead of the deadline?
I'm setting the number of players at the door at 3.5.
Okay. All right.
Are you going over or are you going under?
I'm going over. I'm taking the over.
Darn, I was going to do that too. I like when we're on different sides of kind of the bet. But
do you want me to go under for the? I can go under for the sake of this debate.
No. We'll both go over.
Okay.
But that, you know what? The fact that we're both inclined to go over, it actually illustrates what I'm talking about, where the expectations are, and it's got to be a bit of a nervy position because you can't just be trading your guys for nothing. Like if you're trading players out, it has to make sense, and certainly nothing has made sense yet for the Leafs, and clock's ticking now towards the deadline.
Okay, I want to just touch on a few other Canadian teams very quickly. The Edmonton Oilers are on this list. Andrew Mangiapane, number 7 on your trade board. He was placed on waivers on Sunday. So very likely by the time you get this episode, we'll know his fate. But what can you say about the dossier when it comes to one Andrew Mangiapane?
Well, he's been more difficult for them to move than they expected. His name's been out there for months. We've talked about him on the show. He's been on prior boards. The fit has just not been right. Free agent signing that just feels like from day one, it didn't work for Andrew and didn't work for the Oilers. He's got a $3.6 million cap hit, and I think that's the main reason. Even with a sweetener, Edmonton's had trouble finding a new home for him. I'd be very surprised if he's claimed off waivers, but he still belongs on the trade board if he goes through waivers, because that actually adds something that an acquiring team might like, and that's that he could be sent to the American Hockey League right away. As part of that trade, if a team wants to do that. So I think it just adds an extra level of flexibility, but it's also a sign, Edmonton is a buyer, but they need to clear some cap room. And Mangiapane is the most obvious place to do it because he's been in and out of the lineup so much. He's not really a contributing member of the team, and he is taking up $3.6 million on the cap. So there's a lot the Oilers could do with that if they were able to get that off the books. And, they've got to the point on Sunday where obviously they're hoping someone just grabs them for free at this stage. I think if they trade them, they're going to have to attach, a third round pick or something with them to keep another team wanting to do that, or maybe include them in a larger deal if there's a lot of different pieces and makes sense from the value standpoint. But, Edmonton's, the vibes are not good in Canada, man, is what we're getting at. Cause I feel like, well, they're in a better spot than obviously Toronto, just because the Pacific Division's so weak. They're in a playoff position. The team hasn't played that well. There's huge expectations coming off 2 straight Stanley Cup final appearances. You got Prime 97 and Prime 29, but the team around them hasn't been good enough. And so, but you also don't have the flexibility to get out there and add to the degree you might want to. So, the Oilers are going to be an intriguing one because they need to subtract players or a player, Mangiapane. Maybe it happens. Maybe I'm wrong and he just gets claimed on waivers and that's everything they need. But if not, they're going to have to get creative in trading him. And then, they're looking to bring in a defenseman and another center if they can. So I expect it to be a busy few days in Edmonton, and the stakes are high because they do not want to let this season just slide by, not putting their best foot forward with, because the Pacific's so weak. This is the other side of it. There is a path back to the conference final just sitting right in front of them. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm not disrespecting the Vegas Golden Knights, although you might have seen the stats flying around the internet on them on Sunday that they've only beat, I think, 4 teams in a playoff spot all season long.
Yeah, I saw something like that. That was startling to see.
Impossible. It's not a strong division. The Kings just fired their coach over the weekend.
Yeah.
Jim Hiller.
We haven't even gotten to Jim Hiller yet.
With DJ Smith promoted to on an interim basis. But most of the teams in that division, even after the Panarin deal, like Edmonton laid an 8-1 beating on the Kings in recent days. So, as much as I might sit here and say, man, the Oilers don't look as good as they did the last couple seasons, the path to get to the third round is sitting in front of them. And then you do count on those world-beating difference makers at the top of the lineup having a say in things. So, as bleak as it occasionally looks for the Oilers, I still think that there's a path for them to go on a run again if they can, get it right at this deadline. And so that's some of what Stan Bowman and Jeff Jackson and everyone in Edmonton is working through right now as they wind their way towards the deadline.
Okay, let's move on from Edmonton and go to Winnipeg. Gus Nyquist, Luke Schenn, and Logan Stanley representing the Jets on your trade board. A little bit quieter, or at least a little bit more understated compared to some of the other teams listed, in my opinion. How do you see it for Winnipeg?
Yeah, I mean, they're Toronto Central, Toronto West. I mean, it's the same thing, right? This team won the President's Trophy last year, had expectations, has been a competitive team for a number of years. I mean, they won a playoff series last spring, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't gone well. And, they might not have, look, they have veteran players to sell. Jonathan Toews has already come out and said that he's not going to waive his no move clause. He's going to finish out the season as a Jet, but not everybody else is in that same position. And so, the Jets are going to be sellers for a lot of the same reasons as the Leafs. I think they need to refresh it. I don't think they need to reinvent the wheel because they have some key players signed well beyond this year. With Kyle Connor, Mark Scheifele, guy you might have heard of, Connor Hellebuck, coming off a gold medal win, is signed long-term there. So, it's not a case where I don't think that we're talking about a rebuild, but some kind of retool on the fly here makes sense. And so, those players that they're selling, Gus Nyquist hasn't scored a goal this year, but he did move last year for a second-round pick at the deadline, went from Nashville to Minnesota as an example. And I don't by any means expect that return to be replicated, given that he's a year older and where the season's gone for him. But I'm just illustrating that there could be a market there. Schenn went for 2 draft picks last year at the deadline, a second and a fourth to Winnipeg. I think they should be able to find him a new home. Logan Stanley's an interesting call, though. He's had a real breakout season. The Jets have invested a lot of time into him. They've taken their lumps, right? There's a lot of criticism about him, and he's kind of blossoming right on the great timing for him and his agent, his family, because it's right on the precipice of him being able to hit the open market July 1st. It's not a guarantee that he's moved, because I think there's an argument to be said for signing him and extending him and keeping him around. But if they're not in that position, I think they have to at least consider it, because obviously you don't want to walk out the door for nothing.
Okay, let's get to the Montreal Canadiens. Patrick Laine is also on your board. He's the only Montreal Canadiens player there. I don't know if you saw, there was a practice a couple days ago where they had Patrick Laine lining up as a defenseman. Just a random thing, but still just, I don't know if you noticed that on the timeline.
I missed that, but I've seen teams do that basically when there's an imbalance in skaters, and it's like, you're so far outside of our forward group right now. We need you to take some practice reps to balance things up. Not a great feeling if you're a player.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
But I will say there are good feelings between Laine and the Canadiens. I think everyone's on the same page here. His future lies somewhere beyond Montreal. The Canadiens are working with Laine to make that happen. I think both sides would like to see it happen. He did have a surgery back in October, so he's only played 5 games this year, in part because of his health, in big part because of his health. He's ready, it appears, to return. And he's on an expiring deal. It's a big cap hit at $8.7 million. I know the LA Kings looked at Laine, and I think other teams could as well, just because, maybe you get the Canadiens to retain salary, and it's almost like it's not free, but it's a look at a player who's going to free agency. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the perfect fit long-term to make some sense. Same thing being said, if nothing comes to fruition, Montreal doesn't have to trade him. It would give them a bit more cap flexibility. I think the Canadiens, big picture, while they've been linked to some players here, they don't feel they have to do anything. They'd like to, like any team, if they feel there's a chance to improve their team, they're obviously going to step up and do that. We've seen this front office, made a lot of trades, and a lot of them have worked out well for, getting the Canadiens in the position they're in today. But my sense is this doesn't have to be a move that it doesn't have to be a busy deadline in Montreal. They're willing, But, I think it's really going to be dependent on what the prices are and where things go. So, they'll look to move Laine, and I think they'd bring in another forward if it made sense, but it's got to make sense.
We kind of mentioned the Ottawa Senators a little bit earlier. We didn't get into the fact that Nick Jensen is on the trade board. That tells me, amidst, reports that they might be looking to add a right shot defenseman. I certainly think that could be a position of need. I would take that as maybe they're looking to upgrade, and possibly by having Nick Jensen move, you accommodate another piece in. That's how I could see it. But what do you think?
Yeah, upgrade. And obviously Jensen's an older player who's headed for free agency this summer. So, it could be a move that's just about solidifying the position, moving beyond the season as well. So, Jensen's name has been out there, and, what beauty's in the eye of the beholder, right? And, for another team, the prospect of bringing in a veteran like Jensen who plays, basically there's not enough right shot defensemen in the league to go around. That's actually the truth. Like, it's biologically the truth. There's not enough NHL defensemen who shoot right, for each team to have 3 or 4 on their roster. So, at this point, I think that, Jensen could be someone that's flipped elsewhere as part of, bringing someone else in. And that's why he lands on the board. But I should turn the floor to you, my friend, because you are, you definitely have a better feel on the ground, what's going on with the Sens.
Well, that's the whole thing, right? Cause my, like, as I mentioned earlier, like the fact that they have a right shot, I do think they would benefit from having an upgrade on the right shot position in terms of a defenseman. Seeing Nick Jensen's name there, that, I'm very glad I woke up first thing this morning and read the trade board, because that was like a bit of an aha moment for me. Because as much as I do think maybe they could benefit from adding a secondary forward, you look at their defensive position, right? Like Jake Sanderson, Artem Zub, Thomas Chabot, and their 3 best defensemen. Jensen slightly getting a little bit better after those troubles with the hip. He came back a little bit early. Jordan Spence, who they got in the offseason, is a good defenseman, should be playing more, but I think he's probably a third pairing guy. And Nicholas Montempallo, who was just at the Olympics, he's in and out of their lineup. If the Sens want to make the playoffs, you need to ensure that like your top 4 is at least set, and you have guys who can play there every single day. And if you feel you can get an upgrade on a Nick Jensen, I think that makes sense to me. That's why I'm looking at them at upgrading that position. My sense with the Sens is that they'll probably, I think they'll do something. They'll look to add. I don't think it needs to be necessarily like a massive addition. I think if they were in a much worse spot, they'd be more likely to offload some of those UFAs and get more of those picks, which I get it, still makes conventional sense. But I think with where they're at right now in the standings, 5 points back. But again, you look at the underlying metrics, they should be a lot better than where they are. I see this as a situation where you try to make one little tweak here and there. Maybe you do something a little bigger. We've seen the Sens do that before. But I don't really see them sitting pat at this deadline.
Yeah, makes sense.
Standing pat, not sitting pat. That doesn't make sense. Sorry.
I knew what you meant. Pal.
I appreciate it. I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
No, I think we've emptied the canister. I'm just worried. Let's get this thing posted before it's all outdated.
We always worry about that around this time of year.
Oh,
CJ,
man, it's
you did
impossible.
a great job. I know you did a great job with the board. We'll have we'll have another episode before the deadline later this week. Thank you to everyone who subscribed to the podcast. We'll get back to Ask CJ at some point next week. It's trade deadline week. Everything's flying. You know what it is. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, and we'll talk to you all later this week. Peace.
The Chris Johnston Show. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris and follow Julian @JKA McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.